On the night of December 17, 1995, a Soviet-era Antonov AN-26 dropped 24 crates of arms and military-grade equipment over the Purulia district of West Bengal. This covert operation, which was supposed to remain a secret, would unravel into one of the most monumental arms smuggling cases in Indian history. Niels Hoke, better known by his alias Kim Davy, arrived in West Bengal in the early 90s. Davy was working on a series of welfare projects for Anand Murg, a spiritual group which didn't quite get along with the ruling Marxist Party. Davy claimed atrocities committed by the CPIM against the people of Bengal. He alleged violent suppression of dissent, torture, and widespread public unrest. Davy felt a sense of injustice, but instead of speaking out, he, plausibly with other members of the organization, began to believe that the only way to stop this oppression was through armed resistance. Davy reached out to Peter Bleach, a former British Army officer turned arms dealer. To understand this narrative, we have to pause here for a minute. At least in the eyes of the law, Bleach really wasn't the kind of person to operate under the table. All his dealings were legitimate and within the bounds of international law. So once Bleach arrived in the UK, he relayed all the information he could to MI5. MI5 then forwarded this information to the Indian government, who allegedly responded by saying that they want the guns on the ground and the accused available to arrest all in one spot. After hearing this, Bleach continued as a double agent. Now we can get back to the story. Bleach traveled to Latvia and purchased an AN-26 aircraft, identified by the registration YLLDB. This was purchased from Latvia Airlines for $250,000. The plane was bought under the name Kerala Air Services, Davy's shell company. The aircraft was delivered in Riga, and on November 18, 1995, Davy signed a contract with a group of Latvian crew members. And the crew, originally employed by Latvia Airlines, had taken a 3-month leave to work with Kerala Air Services. Davy and crew then flew to Varanasi for recon purposes. They stayed from November 23 to 27 before departing towards Karachi. Meanwhile, Bleach secured the arms cache from Bulgaria through an organization known as Kintex. Prior to 1992, Kintex operated as an extension of the Bulgarian Communist Party Secret Service, the Committee for State Security. This import-export corporation managed the trade of a wide range of goods, from cigarettes to heavy weaponry. During the 1970s, Kintex was notorious for supplying weapons to smugglers and terrorist groups across Turkey. The shipment was procured from 2 government-owned factories, who were made to believe it's intended for the Bangladesh army. Once the shipment was loaded onto the plane at Burgas airport, an anxious Davy insisted that Bleach get on the plane with him, assuring Bleach that he'd safely be flown back to the UK. Bleach complied, assuming that the crew will be arrested at Varanasi, at which point the British authorities would get him back. The crew made its way to Karachi, where they spent 4 days modifying the instruments for the drop. They equipped it with multiple parachutes to rig onto the crates, adjusted the cargo hold to accommodate the arms cache, and distributed the 4 tons of cargo within the aircraft. They departed on December 17, 1995, ostensibly heading to Dhaka, Bangladesh. They landed in Varanasi to refuel. Upon arrival, Bleach was left astonished and confused that no one had come to arrest them.
My assumption was that the aircraft would be arrested in Varanasi. I knew that British intelligence, and therefore Indian intelligence, knew that that aircraft had to land at Varanasi. There was no choice. It's a very quiet airport. It's a perfect place to make an arrest like that. You know, if there happened to be shooting, there are no innocent bystanders. It's almost deserted. And when it didn't happen, that's the first time I had a slight worry.
Sometime around 11:30 p.m., 24 crates weighing 4,375 kilograms, containing 2 7.62 sniper rifles, 25 9mm pistols, 300 AK-47 rifles, 10 RPG-7 rocket launchers, 23,800 rounds of 7.62 ammunition, 6,000 rounds of 9mm ammunition, 100 anti-tank grenades, 2 night vision binoculars, and 10 telescope sights for rocket launches were all dropped at the intended coordinates. After completing the arms drop, instead of the initial plan of Yangon, the plane made its way to Phuket.
We go to a place called the Karen Beach Hotel, which is sort of like a little resort hotel.
The next morning, they switch on the news.
Up to 200 automatic weapons, detonators and rounds of ammunition have been found by the Indian authorities investigating the alleged arms drop.
अभी तक बरामद किए गए हथियारों में 215 AK-47 और AK-56 राइफल्स, इन राइफल्स के लिए 16,582 राउंड एम्यूनिशन, 78 एंटी टैंक ग्रेनेड्स और 59 हैंड ग्रेनेड्स शामिल हैं। लोकल पुलिस का कहना है कि अभी तक सारे हथियार बरामद नहीं किए जा सके हैं। पुलिस ने लोगों को हथियार लौटाने के लिए वेडनेसडे तक का वक्त दिया है। इसके बाद हाउस टू हाउस सर्च शुरू की जाएगी।
Bleach quickly realized what had happened. Now, every major country in the world flies using feet as their default metric, but two exceptions to this are China and Russia. So instead of dropping the payload at the intended 3,000 feet, they dropped it at 3,000 meters.
Unfortunately, the pilot flew at 3,000 meters above sea level, which was far too high. So whilst the drop was perfectly on target in a straight line, we were far too high, so of course it overshot considerably.
Davy even gave Bleach the option to fly back home from Phuket. But Bleach felt that if he were to suddenly appear back in England and the arms had been found in India, it would look a little suspicious, especially because the aircraft could have easily been traced back to him. So he decides to give the Indian authorities a second chance to capture the crew. They fly over the Indian Ocean, making their way to Madras. Bleach was certain this would be the moment the crew was arrested. Yet nothing happened. As Davy puts it,
Og der er ikke ét løftet øjebryn, der er ingenting. Og så ånder jeg lidt lettet op, fordi jeg tænker, okay, mit skjold virker endnu.
On December 22nd, 1995, en route to Karachi, the aircraft was intercepted by Indian Air Force MiG-21s. The aircraft was forced to land at Mumbai's Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj International Airport. When they landed, multiple sources claim that no authority was present, and eventually, they were asked to taxi to a remote tarmac area. Davy even says to two of the crew members that they can all climb the wall and escape then and there. The crew responds by saying that they trust Bleach completely. When the authorities finally arrived, they engaged Bleach in a dialogue. Meanwhile, Davy asks another official where the fuel and taxes office is. This was the last anyone saw Davy that night. Bleach was certain that the authorities would finally place them all under arrest. But as it turns out, it was nothing more than a routine customs search. Keep in mind, by this time, the authorities were already aware of the flight call sign and had supposedly spent days looking for it.
My first thought is, now we're being arrested, now they've realized. But that's not true either. This is just a routine customs search. You know, in India, they're not short of people. So where here 2 or 3 men would arrive, they will come with 30 because that's cheap. They search the aircraft, find absolutely nothing, and the aircraft's fueled up. We're ready to go. We give him our passports, and suddenly he says, "Where is Kim P. Davy?" And I haven't seen him since he came out of the aircraft with his bag. So I assume he's left with the deputy manager of the airport to go and pay for the fuel, because the fuel's got to be paid for. And they raided the airport. No, nobody is here. So we're all arrested on immigration offences for smuggling Kim Davy into India illegally. We're taken back to the terminal.
There are many conflicting reports as to what happened during the arrest. But here's what Mumbai's former police commissioner R.D. Tyagi was telling the general population.
पुलिस ने इस बात को डिनाई किया है कि उनकी हिरासत से एक क्रू मेंबर भाग निकला है। पुलिस कमिश्नर ने कहा कि जब प्लेन पुलिस के चार्ज में दिया गया तो उसमें 6 ही क्रू मेंबर्स थे।
जब पुलिस ने चार्ज लिया जहाज का तो उस टाइम 6 ही आदमी थे जहाज के अंदर, और उन्होंने बोला कि मतलब जो मैनिफेस्ट था उसके अंदर 7 आदमी का नाम था। तो हम इस चीज़ की इंक्वायरी कर रहे हैं कि वो आदमी वाकई यहाँ लैंड हुआ है कि नहीं हुआ है। इट इज बीइंग इन्वेस्टिगेटेड, क्योंकि जो इन्फॉर्मेशन हमको मिली है इन 6 आदमियों ने बताया है, और शुरू में बहुत सी चीज़ें इन्होंने गलत बताई हैं। हो सकता है कि स्टेटमेंट का गलत भी हो, और हो सकता सही भी हो।
Once taken back to the terminal, Bleach was being questioned by a man named J.K. Dutt, who was a joint director of the CBI. Bleach shares that the crew is behind the arms drop and that he had been keeping the British government informed for months. Unfortunately for Bleach, Dutt informed him that the British High Commissioner knows nothing of him and that this is an internal Indian matter which does not concern the UK. Now, I just want to emphasize that Bleach has maintained this version of the story from day one. Here's footage of him soon before the very delayed trial began.
Please say, continue. How are you defending yourself?
On the facts prove my innocence.
What are the facts that you have to defend yourself?
The facts are that I'm not guilty of the case and the CBI is lying to the court. They know this.
Are you satisfied that the trial is finally beginning?
Well, I'm very pleased that the truth will finally come out and the CBI can stop trying to fool the Indian people. What happened in this matter?
Do you think the Britain government is also involved?
I have no idea.
Bleach decided to defend his own case. Upon reviewing copies of the evidence, he saw that files from one of the special branch officers from North Yorkshire through London had been altered.
Sergeant Elcock, the special branch officer, tried to make it seem as if he'd come to see me in the course of an investigation that he was carrying out. In other words, I was a suspect, right from the word go. This was completely different from the truth. And when I saw that, I felt a huge sense of betrayal.
Now, this is true, but that would signal towards is an obvious conspiracy that both Indian and British intelligence dismissed national security and the interests of the general population to save face. Sounds like a bit of a stretch, right? I mean, come on. That would mean that both these agencies are spineless and for sale, no integrity whatsoever. Right? Well, it just so happens that Elcock was unaware that his colleagues had previously sent Bleach copies of the original evidence. So after extensive cross-examination, Elcock was indicted for perjury for fabricating false evidence. I think Bleach puts it best when he says this.
It's one thing to deny all knowledge of somebody, but it's an entirely different thing to falsify evidence. Let's not forget, there was a death sentence available on the charges that I was facing.
Not only were the accused found guilty, but they were sentenced to life.
Help your case the most.
The British government becoming honest and telling the truth about what happened in this matter.
How did you get involved with this case?
Because I was asked to become involved by Special Branch in North Yorkshire.
Just 7 months after they were sentenced, the Latvian crew was pardoned by K.R. Narayanan on the 22nd of July, 2000. Why were they pardoned? Well, we've never actually been told. But it might have had something to do with the fact that Putin was due to arrive in India and sign a deal in relation to Sukhoi fighter planes. This is something that India really wanted. It was quite significant because the planes could act as a means to carry nuclear bombs. And it's theorized and widely accepted that Putin used his influence and had the Latvian crew pardoned. At this point, Kim Davy and the Latvian crew, in other words, the people who acted with conscious intent, were not behind bars. Yet the double agent who tried to prevent the drop acted in good faith and maintained integrity throughout this whole ordeal was contracting tuberculosis in an Indian prison. This man was made to serve a societal and political sentence for a crime he never committed. But he made it so that it's more trouble to keep him in jail than it would be to keep him out. With help from people who have consciences both in India and the UK, his story was never out of the press. Eventually, it was concluded that life would be a lot easier for everyone if he was out of jail. Against all odds, this man proved to have a stronger will than multiple intelligence agencies and governments who, by his own account, virtually wanted him dead. And on the 4th of February 2004, after serving more than 7 years of his life in an Indian prison, his release finally came following diplomatic efforts by the UK government and pressures from Amnesty International.
Nothing can replace the years that I've lost. It's been a long struggle since 1995, and I feel vindicated that the government of India has finally taken the decision to free me, as it did the 5 Latvians who were released in July 2000.
But there's a huge chunk of the timeline we haven't covered. What happened to Davy? Where was he during all this time? Well, he suggests that the Indian government didn't really pursue him until 2002, when India formally requested Denmark to extradite him. Justice Minister Lene Espersen of Denmark stated that Davy could not be extradited to India due to concerns of human rights violations, particularly in the risk of torture or inhumane treatment. In 2008, Davy publishes De Kalde Mig Terrorist, where Davy gives an autobiographical account of his life, detailing his humanitarian work over a 14-year period starting in 1982. His initiatives included building schools, engaging in agricultural projects, and participating in tiger conservation. The same year the book gets published, India tries to extradite him again, but this time, they have a trick up their sleeve. They provided Denmark with sovereign assurance. including waiving the death penalty if convicted. These are the key details of the extradition agreement between Denmark and India, which were altered from previous agreements due to the treatment of Camilla Bro during her extradition to the United States. These include death penalty clause, no execution of a potential death sentence. Humane treatment assurance, the extradited individual must be treated humanely during their detention abroad. Post-conviction transfer, if convicted, the individual must be returned to Denmark to serve their sentence within 3 weeks of the conviction. Additionally, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Manfred Novak, described India's assurances as not worth the paper they are written on, further nullifying these assurances. Yet still, Davy was finally set to be extradited. He contested the decision in court, obviously. Reports surfaced suggesting that India's judicial system is not bound to uphold the terms of the extradition agreement. This concern arose from a Supreme Court ruling in the case of Abu Salim, an extradited convict from Portugal. The ruling, which disregarded certain conditions of Salim's extradition, raised doubts about India's adherence to such agreements. This precedent significantly impacted the extradition case against Davy, as the agreement between Denmark and India explicitly prohibits the imposition of a death sentence. And on the 30th of June 2010, the High Court of East Denmark ruled that Davy should not be extradited to India based on risk of torture by authorities. For the next decade, India attempted its last-ditch diplomatic efforts trying to convince Denmark to reconsider its stance. The most shocking development since the crew's initial arrest took place on April 28, 2011, when the primary accused and J.K. Dutt gave a live interview to Times Now. This interview/debate introduced a slew of new information about the case to the public. It was essentially the first time in 16 years that we got to hear the defense for ourselves. Now, almost 2 decades after the drop, here's what Davy claimed. The arms were meant for Anandamurg. The intention was to arm the group to defend themselves against the political suppression and violence allegedly perpetrated by the ruling CPIM. He claimed the CPIM had systematically targeted Anandamurg members, leading to the need for self-defense. He goes on to explain that the operation was covertly sanctioned by Indian intelligence agencies, specifically RAW. He alleged that RAW had prior knowledge of the arms drop and permitted it to proceed as part of a larger political agenda. He suggested that the arms drop was part of an effort by political factions in India to destabilize the CPIM. He further alleged that the radar at Kailakund Air Base, located near the drop zone in Purulia, was switched off by government officials, allowing the aircraft to operate undetected. This was a big deal. It wasn't treated as such, but it really is. Radars aren't really switched off, and when they are, it's under very specific circumstances or valid reasons, neither of which are applicable to the arms drop. Keep in mind, Davy made the same trip earlier in November in preparation for the drop. If officials actually knew what they were looking for, which they allegedly did, they would have found it a month before the drop took place. The case notes from the initial trial touch on this momentarily. See it for yourselves. So we're discussing a Danish Anandamurgi accompanied by a double Asian-British arms dealer with guns sourced from government-owned factories in Bulgaria on a Soviet flight with a Latvian crew flying in from Karachi into Indian airspace over one of the most militarized borders in the world to drop a 4-ton payload of arms cache. Yet, the informative highlight of this debate was when Davy explained how he escaped the night of the arrest. Right after Davy fled the airport, he made his way to Pune, where his contacts told him to get on a plane to New Delhi ASAP. The next day, when he arrived at the capital, he was allegedly received in an official Indian government vehicle with people who sat him down in the back seat and escorted him to the residence of Rajesh Ranjan, better known as Pappu Yadav. His residence was located, quote, in view of the president's residential dome. He goes on to claim that shortly after, J.K. Dutt arrived at the house and arranged for Davy to be put on a train from Delhi to a small train station which he couldn't make out because he was wrapped in blankets. There, 3 other government vehicles were waiting, complete with 2 AK-47 gunmen who drove Davy straight from the station platform over the border and into Nepal, where Davy was dropped off at a bus depot from where he escaped back to Denmark. Davy claims Yadav was working in collaboration with Narasimha Rao's PMO. J.K. Dutt completely denied the allegations, stating that he was nowhere near the scene so far as Davy's escape is concerned. Davy goes on to state that the chief of CBI 96 onwards had claimed he was politically pressured to stop the investigation. Dutt responds by saying that is for him to answer. But throughout the entire segment, it was Bleach, with his rational and eloquent articulation, who really stole the show.
But really, it's terribly sad to see a man of Mr. Dutt's stature wriggling away from the truth there. He knows very well that he was the clean-up merchant for the Indian government in this whole thing. He laid the smokescreen himself, along with his colleague who went to Latvia and threatened the crews of the Latvian pilots. I gave him and his colleagues a 30-page statement detailing every possible action that took place in this. And when it came to court at a later stage, his colleagues in the CBI denied that Mr. Dutt had ever been involved in the case. They said he'd never been to Kolkata and interviewed me. That's an absolute lie. I think, with the greatest respect to Mr. J.K. Dutt, he has a great deal of questions to answer in this matter, and he can't get past it with bluster, which is the usual way that these things are dealt with. Well, let's get back to the point. It pains me to see a man of Mr. Dutt's stature struggling like this. His colleague, Loknath Behera, who was at the time a superintendent of the police, it is a matter of record that I filed a petition before the Honourable Court in Calcutta asking that Mr. Dutt be called as evidence, and the CBI told the learned court that Mr. Dutt had never been to Kolkata, had never been involved in the investigation, in exactly the same way that the CBI denied that Superintendent Krista Brannerud of Interpol had ever carried out an investigation into this case. It's all a pack of lies. The fact of the matter is that the CBI knew very well that Kim Davy, or Mr. Niels Hulk, as we know he is called now, was sitting in Denmark. But J.K. Dutt and his colleagues were sending people all over the world at the cost of the Indian taxpayer, South America, Australia, pretending to chase Kim P. Davy. They knew where he was. They never wanted him back because they were in on the deal. I was specifically told by MI5 that the Indian government wanted these guns to be delivered, and they told me that they would arrest the plane at Varanasi, and I was very surprised when the plane wasn't arrested at Varanasi. But let me just say this. Some years before I was released from jail, a gentleman by the name of Deepak Praladkar screened a film at the Calcutta Press Club showing Niels Hulk, or Mr. Kim P. Davy as we know him, speaking from his home in Copenhagen. And this was to show the courts that the CBI was wrong in saying, but still the CBI was chasing all over the courts, all over the world to look for this chap, and they were telling the courts that they did not know where he was. Now, I wonder what Mr. J.K. Dutt says about that, because what Mr. Dutt actually did was he kept me in jail as a scapegoat because I was British, and really, if the truth be known, he hoped I would die in jail and that this whole thing would fall away. Unfortunately, Mr. Dutt, much as I respect you as a person, I didn't die in jail, and this isn't going to go away.
There's a lot to keep track of, so let's go over all the oddities we've established thus far. Bleach acted in good faith. Bleach was working closely with British intelligence, providing extensive details about the arms drop ages before it took place. He even told the Defence Export Services Organisation and the local North Yorkshire Police Special Branch of the drop in August 1995. This was 4 months before the drop took place. Then another point of interest lies in a book published in 2005 called Spies, Lies and Whistleblowers, penned by former MI5 officer Annie McConn, where even she accuses Bleach of being an MI6 agent involved in the Purulia arms drop. Warnings from MI5 were willingly ignored. In mid-November and early December, MI5 sent multiple communications to the Indian government, including a final urgent warning just before the drop. Yet the response from the Indian central government was absurd.
But here was a case in which people had alerted you not once but on 3 occasions. Government to government cooperation on terrorism. And what did you do? You had specific coordinates. I remember the first briefings from senior officials of West Bengal Police, CID, CBI people, Mr. Dutt, a younger Mr. Dutt. They all said, this is a very big mystery. Nobody knew this. We are looking for Kim Peter Davy, a New Zealander. They knew all along he was a Dane. Danish declassified documents are now saying this. this Mr. Shanti Prakash, who was then a joint secretary in the Home Ministry, he sent a letter on the 12th of December warning the West Bengal government, and perhaps to ensure that it didn't reach the government on time, he sent it by registered post, which is the slowest way of sending a letter.
And Mr. Dar-
And he went on. He enjoyed a very good career. He retired. He was Chief Secretary of Tripura, and after retirement, he got sinecures.
It's crucial to note that this incident isn't distant history. This occurred in 1995, a time when fax machines were widely used. The infrastructure to send urgent communication both existed and was widely available. It just, for some unexplained reason, wasn't used. The CBI was playing dumb. American intelligence initially suggested that Kim Davy was from New Zealand. I spent some of my most formative years in Auckland. This is not a Kiwi's crime. Regardless, during the initial investigation, the authorities were looking for a New Zealander, even though Bleach had repeatedly stated both before and after his arrest that Davy was a Danish national. Here's him making the claim on national television amidst the trial.
Peter Bleach, how were you involved in this case?
I'm involved in this because I was dragged into it by some Danish citizens. Your viewers should know that this entire matter was planned and executed by Danish citizens in Copenhagen.
How would you characterize Kim Davy, also known as Nielsen?
As a very dangerous terrorist indeed.
Multiple radars were coincidentally non-operational. Radars at Kailakund, Dhanbad and Kolkata, key facilities for monitoring air traffic, were all non-functional on the night of, and only the night of, the drop. Furthermore, Kerala Air Services, under which the plane was operated, had an MOU with Shaheen Aviation, a firm repeatedly alleged by the Indian media to be a front for Pakistan's ISI. Regardless of whether or not this widespread allegation was true, the fact that a company with such dealings managed to secure permits to enter Indian airspace, subjectively speaking, is a bit fishy. The Anand Merg had political ties. Both Bleach and Davy alleged that certain individuals in India, including senior political figures, were aware of the drop and complicit in the conspiracy. Pappu Yadav had very clear ties to the Anand Merg. He studied at an Anand Merg school, was born to Anand Mergis. He denies involvement in the arms drop, but very recently made a curious statement about the radar failures. Here's part of what he said.
ये आनंद मार्ग पर आरोप लगा था। हम आनंद मार्गी हैं। मेरे फादर वाइस प्रेसिडेंट थे, अंगीकार समाज के सेक्रेटरी थे। आप हमको बताइए, ये जो प्लेन इन किया था, तो रेडार हाइक हुआ होगा। बिना रेडार हाइक के तो प्लेन इन किया नहीं होगा। तो नरसिम्हा राव की सरकार थी।
This is the first time I came across the idea of a radar hack being both entertained and presented to the public. Now, out of all the things that have been suggested in reference to this case, this is by far the easiest to dismiss. Considering all the resources the accused had available, the chances that they managed to hack multiple radars, including the ones in Dhanbad, Kailakund and Kolkata, are slim to none. Had they actually managed to do so successfully, then the trial would be far more concerned with those failings than the actual drop. The kind of radars we used in 1995 generally required human operation and active surveillance. While the level of automation varied depending on the radar sophistication, human involvement was critical for their functioning, including setup, monitoring, interpretation, and decision-making. It is far more plausible that they had people on the inside who had these radars turned off, and for any country, you cannot pull that off with low-ranking credentials. It's also worth noting that Yadav lost to Ajit Sarkar, a CPIM leader in the 1995 Bihar Legislative Assembly elections. Yadav was also convicted for the 1998 murder of Ajit Sarkar, though he was later acquitted in 2013. So far as Davy's claims of being hidden at Yadav's house, after researching this, I haven't come across a single journalist, independent or otherwise, over the span of 2 decades that actually investigated these claims. 2 properties in New Delhi could fit the description. Accommodations in this specific region are mostly awarded to members of the Lok Sabha, which Yadav first became in 1991. The following illustration is working with a straight line from the presidential dome that Davy was referring to. So let's establish a hypothetical, that within 2 kilometers of the dome, it is clearly visible. Up to 5 kilometers, it is plausibly visible, and anything beyond that will only be visible from elevated ground. The first address is AB7 Bandara Road. According to the official Sansad website, this is Yadav's present address. It's located approximately 3.14 kilometers away. And that is technically in the human line of sight, but for whatever reasons, I personally wasn't very convinced. Then there's 11A Balwant Rai Mehta Lane, an address that Yadav was forced to vacate, which is about 2.74 kilometers in a straight line. And while this is still outside the radius that I'm considering to be clearly visible, this story is from 1995. Since then, the region has seen an upkeep in greenery, infrastructural development, and quite simply put, a subtle but new skyline has since developed. Yes, it's entertaining to go through these findings and intuitively connect the dots. But that's not how the law works, and for good reason. Pappu Yadav must be assumed innocent until proven otherwise. Furthermore, the information here is incomplete. What we've gone over is purely speculative. It doesn't consider the whereabouts of Datta Yadav at the time. It doesn't factor in when these properties were allotted. It doesn't factor in a myriad of evidence-based information, which the public has never been given access to, outside of unmerited individual accounts. So this whole section about his house and the presidential dome, although interesting, will not be making my list. But the next point will. The investigation was sabotaged by government officials. Former CBI Director Joginder Singh candidly admitted that the investigation was hampered by political interference. Singh stated, "When I was heading the investigation in the case, I was discouraged by the political establishment at higher levels. Moreover, lack of professionalism and proper documentation is the main reason for this continuous failure." Unnamed Indian politicians with enough power to hamper the director of the CBI's investigation did not want the Indian public to become aware of what took place. Peter Bleach was not given a fair trial. Despite clear evidence being recognized that there was an attempt to frame Bleach with a death penalty on the line, he, along with the flight crew, were sentenced to life. Now take a look at this list of facts. Really, take a moment to recognize what we've established took place, and then realize there's so much more. One piece of information which the public knows little about is the case of Mangal Prasad Pandey. He was a taxi driver in Varanasi, and when the plane initially arrived from Karachi and stayed for about 8 hours, Pandey transported the aircraft passengers. His involvement as a driver for these individuals made him a key government witness in the investigation. The information he provided helped establish the movements and activities of the accused. On January 7, 2014, Pandey was found murdered near a railway track in Patna. Pandey had been missing since January 4th, when his taxi was discovered parked near the Lal Bahadur Shastri Airport, with the keys still inside. Coincidentally, exactly 5 months after the Unsolved documentary had premiered. Not much is known beyond this, and reinforcing the standard of the Indian judicial system, the case still remains unsolved. Then there's the fact that the official charge sheet named 13 individuals. However, many of them, including some who were reportedly present at the intended drop site and had clear links to Anand Mirg, had absconded. They were somehow deemed insignificant or irrelevant in the eyes of the law. Most of them were never apprehended. One of the 13 individuals was an Anand Mirgi by the name of Deepak Manikan. His involvement with the drop is blurry to say the least. Manikan is a Singaporean of Indian descent. He is considered to be one of the planners and logistics facilitators of the drop. Yet the charges against him were dropped early into the investigation, and he barely had to face the court of public opinion. The first time we heard his side of the story was in 2014 through the Danish documentary I just mentioned. It was a mixture of photographs, videos, dramatic recreations, extended interviews, and documentation to support the claims of the accused where applicable. This documentary pissed off a lot of old people, and the involved governments tried to distance themselves from the narrative. It even played on Indian televisions a few years ago. But, as is true for all healthy democracies, if you're watching this video in India, at least at the time of this being published, the documentary is really difficult to come across. Think you'll find a torrent? Try. I don't know if this is subtle censorship or a rights issue, but I really wanted to watch it. So I stopped looking on free speech Minecraft servers when I realized it was easier for me to get a hold of the director than it was the bloody movie. So I got my copy through him. There's an extended version of the documentary that has an interview with Manikan himself. This guy had no motive or incentive to defend the accused, and he never really did. But on his own account, his story confirms Bleach's version of all that took place, which in turn confirms Davy's version. These people had every reason to throw one another under the bus, yet they didn't. And I am of the belief that there is no honor amongst thieves. The final point of interest is a man named Christopher Bernard. This agent wrote and submitted a 30-page report to Interpol. This report is considered the holy grail of the arms drop, complete with thorough exploration of evidence and conclusive statements. Soon after submission, this report was made classified. Both Davy and Bleach have been asking for years to declassify it to be used in a fair trial. Yet, as we saw earlier, Bleach publicly alleged,
in exactly the same way that the CBI denied that Superintendent Krista Brannerud of Interpol had ever carried out an investigation into this case. It's all a pack of lies.
I understand I've posed you with a lot of information throughout this video, but truly speaking, there's much more that I'm leaving out in the interest of time. But very simply put, here is what the accused are trying to allege happened in terms so simple and so clear that even a child can understand. The accused claimed that members of the Anand Merg were being targeted by the CPIM, and that an agitated and empathetic Pappu Yadav, in some form of a collaboration with the central government in New Delhi, and specifically the awareness of Narasimha Rao's PMO, hatched a plot to destabilize the CPIM and create a situation for president's rule in West Bengal. They had several radars turned off for that night and that night only, while ensuring a safety of passage for Kim Davy, which they honored. Once the drop became public and the narrative spun out of control, they abandoned their objectives and spent their efforts on saving face and maintaining power, even if it meant scapegoating the one person who was working in the interest of the Indian people. Let's clarify something right here, because I do not wish for my words to be misconstrued. I'm not trying to convince anyone of what happened that night, but I do maintain the position that the narrative of the accused is far more believable than the narrative that the government has convinced itself of. Even in gathering information about the case, while it is true that all I've presented is available to the public, it's not necessarily very accessible. In fact, to obtain it, I had to use multiple VPNs, speak to lawyers and judges with decades of experience, get in touch with an international film director, and had to spend a fair bit of money to obtain certain information. But subjectively, after having spent over a decade in this country, I believe these alleged terrorists possess far more character than the Indian government, or any government for that matter, but my guess is as good as anyone else's. What you choose to believe is completely your prerogative, and my objective here isn't trying to defend these people. I just want to make sure both sides of the stories are out there for anyone interested. All I've done is given you independent dots. Connect them however you so please.